Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to our workshop series. I'm Mitch Menchaca. I'm the Executive Director of the City of Phoenix Office of Arts and Culture, and excited that you're taking this Thursday morning with everything going on in the world to be here with us. It's exciting that we get to have the opportunity to participate, and it's important because during this pandemic, we've heard from artists who have had questions about elevating business practices or trying to how to understand to protect art online and really how to navigate the future moving forward into this next normal. So I am thrilled that the staff was able to put this program together, and we have a few Office of Arts and Culture staff that you might see on the screen, including Katie Bayares, who is hosting this presentation, Anel Ariola, Barry Sparkman, Sarah Leon Moreno, and Ed Lebo, our Public Art Program Director. We are thrilled to have Sarah Conley Odenkirk, a LA attorney who specializes in art law for more than 20 years. She has great expertise in commercial art, public art, cultural policy, and more. She chairs the Contemporary Arts Council at UCLA's Fowler Museum and has served on many national and regional boards, including the Americans for the Arts Public Art Network. We're delighted to have her leading this great series on what every artist should think about doing in building and running better businesses. So I will turn it over to Katie for some housekeeping, and then we'll dive right in.
Hi there, everybody. I just want to remind you of a couple things and let you know how this is going to go. Sarah will give a presentation for about 30 minutes, and then at the end, we will go through all of your questions. So as she's going through the presentation, if you have questions, please type them in the chat box, and my colleagues Barry and Anel will be recording them. Also, if you could just keep yourself on mute, that's very helpful to us because we are going to be recording this whole conversation to post later onto YouTube, and that helps us keep the audio nice and clear for that recording. With that being said, Sarah, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you, Katie. Thank you, Mitch. And thank you to everybody at the Phoenix Office of Arts and Culture. This is really a pleasure to be here today. And of course, I'm going to go over everything everybody needs to know about business in 30 minutes, which might mean I might talk too quickly for anybody to understand what I'm saying. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to scratch the surface of a few topic areas that I think are most helpful. And hopefully you all will have some questions, and so we can focus the conversation toward the end on those things that are particularly of interest to you. I am going to now attempt some technology. I'm going to see if I can share my screen here so that we can use the PowerPoint presentation. Okay, let's see if that works. Is everyone able to see the slides? Excellent. Okay. So here's my introductory slide, business basics for artists, which is of course the topic for today. I will skip over my introductory slide since Mitch already covered that, and we'll get right to it. I've broken this down into a couple of different categories, and the first thing that we'll take a look at are workspaces, resources, plans, and budgets. And again, I'm just scratching the surface here, so if there's anything that comes up that catches your interest or about which you have a question, go ahead and make a note of that, and you can send it to Katie, and we can talk about it as we get through this. So the first thing is workspace. Hopefully nobody's workspace actually looks like this, but I'm sure we all know the feeling. I certainly do as I look around my office. And from the standpoint of being an artist, of course, there's always the question of where are you performing your art? Where are you creating your work? Where are you doing your practice? So that could be a studio space. It could be at home. Certainly now during the pandemic, lots of people are working from home. And so most people have figured out a way to do their craft within whatever space is necessary, which is wonderful. But it's also really important to think about where you're actually doing the business of your practice. So I always recommend that there be a corner, a desk, particular area that's set aside specifically to address the business needs of your art practice. And it's important to keep track of things because that is exactly how we stay on top of whether it's the project or future plans. So it's much easier to do this if you set aside a dedicated space. And this can be for immediate projects, but also I come in a lot of times to deal with legacy issues. So after an artist has passed away or as an artist is planning for the future, and I will tell you, it is so much easier to deal with issues within an artist's practice if there's a dedicated space where there are files that exist and the practice has been kept track of in a way that other people can follow as well. So to that end, organized filing. I realize this is a lot to ask. It's a lot to ask from me as well. But creating files for each project is a really basic and important thing to think about as you're looking at your business practices in general. So this can be important, of course, in your day-to-day practice anyway, but I will say that during the pandemic, it was particularly important because a number of funds were set up to compensate artists and help provide some support during this really difficult time. And especially for performing artists, it became important to be able to show that you had a gig lined up and that gig got canceled in order to apply for funding. So if you didn't have records and you didn't have files that you were keeping for those jobs, it would be very hard to prove that you were entitled, in fact, to receive some funds. So it can be really practical and important in keeping track of those things. Finally, you want to make sure that this workspace is secure. And by secure, it's going to mean different things for different people and for different locations. Certainly secure from damage from things like weather or other elements, like don't put your papers right next to the hot plate or the microwave. They may very quickly get destroyed and or start a fire. Secure from other people. If you're in a shared space, it may be important to keep your business materials locked so that other people can't be getting into it. Secure from yourself. Make a habit of having that designated spot so that you're not leaving paperwork around the house or saving it into different files on your computer. Which brings me to the last point, which is that the file keeping process can be something that you're either dealing with in an analog setting with actual file folders and pieces of paper, or it may be something that you're maintaining online, in which case make sure you've got your system password protected and secure. So that is the quick rundown for Workspace. Next is important to take a look at the resources that you use in order to hone your craft. What do you need? What are your supplies, art supplies, musical instruments? Do you need a space to create and practice? Do you need special equipment, access to fabrication facilities, or things like cameras, larger pieces of equipment? By paying attention to this and making a list, you can figure out what it is you have and what the value of that is, and we'll get to why that value is important in a moment. What you want, what is it that you're thinking about moving toward in your practice? What are things that you would like to acquire in your future in order to help you with your craft? And what's going to help you get to the next level? So these things are very important to think about as we get into the next area, which is planning. And again, I'm just scratching the surface with this. It's a little hard to scratch the surface so minutely here, but when you're making plans for your practice, thinking about things like goals, and this gets back to some of the resources questions that I outlined a moment ago, it's important to pay attention to what it is you're trying to achieve with your practice. Where do you want to see your career short-term, medium-term, and long-term? What is it that you are aiming to achieve? And what are the actions that you can take in order to get there? These are things that you can talk about with a consultant, a lawyer. There are career supports that you can find, and we'll get into that in a moment when we talk about team building. but it is a really good idea to give some thought to what that plan is. Many artists are just simply creating because there is the need to create, and hopefully there's a demand for the products. But taking a look at your longer term goals and the actions that will get you there is an important check-in to do from time to time. All right, this may be the most important thing, of course. And generally speaking, artists and many business people, as it turns out, are not so great in figuring out realistic budgets for their practice. And this can create quite a lot of challenge when somebody is trying to accomplish the goals and plans that hopefully have been outlined. One place to start with budget is to list monthly expenses, list occasional expenses, and keep track of income. These are obviously really basic things to be paying attention to when we think about budget. But again, in order to determine what you need to do in order to attain goals, it's important to understand where you sit currently with your practice and where you need to be in order to achieve those goals. It also can help you price your work and price your engagement with whoever is hiring you or commissioning you for work, or whoever is purchasing your work. And having a clear-ish idea of what it costs for you to do your work and clear enough to help pay your bills will make the pricing of the work and the way that you interact with the audience and consumer a lot clearer. It also might make clear that you need to have a side gig, and a lot of people have side gigs, and I know that this ends up being a bit of a point of conversation for a lot of artists. People want to just be focused on their craft, which is completely understandable, but really there's no shame in having other streams of income, especially during difficult times like this. Many people have to have different streams of income in order to allow them to have the space to create artwork. Okay, jumping to the next gigantic topic, risk protection. So once we have a little bit of an overview idea of where the business is and some idea of how we're going to maintain records and keep track of business, all the business issues, we can dig in a little bit more to issues like risk protection. So the two issues here are insurance and incorporation. Again, just scratching the surface here, but I know that these tend to be hot topics when we're talking about protecting business interests. Insurance. So for this, as well as the next topic of incorporation, you'll likely need to speak with a financial planner or an accountant, and certainly when it comes to insurance, an insurance agent is really helpful. It is constantly a question as to who's a good insurance agent to deal with. My recommendation usually is for people to speak with peers in the same business. It's very helpful to get personal recommendations. Going through the phone book can work, or going through the online listings can work, but it's really nice to get that personal reference. Presumably, most of you will already have car insurance or other insurances already in place, homeowners insurance, renters insurance, and so often that agent can help you as well. So what kind of insurance do artists need? You may need insurance for your practice itself, so covering your business, covering your supplies, materials, and the work that you're doing. Of course, most artwork can be irreplaceable, so I'm not sure how secure it makes one feel to have insurance for the artwork. It's really more a question of ensuring the ability to continue practicing after a disaster. Really important for people who work with their bodies, of course, is health insurance. People who travel for work, car insurance, and if you are working out of your home, of course, having your home insured, as well as particularly the studio space that you've set up. Additionally, one term to keep in mind is umbrella insurance. Umbrella insurance is usually relatively inexpensive. That's something that can provide insurance. It's like an umbrella. It provides insurance when limits have been reached or other insurance does not cover. So something to ask insurance agents about in order to give an extra level of protection. General liability insurance is important to pay attention to if you've got a studio outside or if you've got people coming into your business, and that liability insurance would cover any injuries or issues that come up with regard to people being on your premises. With regard to specific events or exhibitions, if there is an insurance requirement, which there often is in contracts when people are engaged, there is the possibility of getting a rider on your existing insurance policies in order to cover those occasional events. So again, something to speak about with your insurance agent. It may not be that you need general liability insurance all the time, but it may be just for specific events that you'll need to get a rider. The other issue, of course, is making sure that any premises where you're performing or selling your work or exhibiting your work, checking into what insurance that location has, because oftentimes your activities can be covered under somebody else's insurance. One of the biggest areas of controversy, certainly in public art, but in other work for hire type situations or commission situations, especially when you're working in a construction type environment, is there's often a requirement, or at least a request, for artists to obtain professional liability or errors and omissions insurance. Generally speaking, this is not available to artists, and so this can be a point of contention since it is available to your traditional contractor who's doing construction work, or it's available to professionals like engineers and architects. It will be requested for artist contracts. It's generally not something that's obtainable. The few times they have seen artists obtain the P&L or E&O insurance, the problem is that it indicates that they have a license that they probably don't have. So check those policies very carefully and make sure that you're negotiating those requirements out of contracts rather than obligating yourself to insurance that you can't get. One way to deal with the requests for professional liability or errors and omissions, if you're working with designers or engineers or architects, other licensed professionals, is to ensure that they are licensed, bonded, and insured in the location where you're working, and have them stamp your documents so that their insurance covers any issues that come out of faulty engineering or things like that. Okay, so personal, we talked a little bit about the personal health insurance, car insurance, that sort of thing. And then the business insurance being the last bits of general liability, professional liability, and that. Okay, incorporation. So incorporation is a tricky topic, and it's certainly one that you're going to want to have professionals involved in helping you at least determine what kind of incorporation you might need. I like to have accountants or financial planners involved in this conversation, because as much as I may know about a client, I generally don't know the full picture financially for them. So having in place a corporate entity can impact your overall financial picture, and it's important that you've got everybody involved in that coming together to make that decision. It's also really good to understand that you can be a sole proprietor. That's a perfectly legitimate way of running a business. You don't have to be incorporated in order to have a legitimate business. When you're a sole proprietor, a lot of the separating of accounts and separating of functions and different hat wearing applies just as it does for other incorporations as well. I'm going to call them regular corporations, but your standard corporation is referred to as a C corporation. There's also, you can see listed here on the picture, there's the S corporations, which are a different kind of corporations. The S corporations are much more akin to LLCs because they have a different way of being treated by the IRS. All right, so let's take a step back here. C corporations. These structures tend to be financially advisable when you're making a fair amount of money and can take advantage of some tax benefits that C Corps allow for. But be aware that if you do a regular incorporation, you are potentially liable for end of the year taxes on the corporation and then taxes again when you take money out of it. So C Corps generally are not the organizational structures that are recommended for artists unless you have other income and other assets that make that a better choice. Whether you choose a C Corp or an S Corp or an LLC, you have what's called limited liability. And that's really the main difference between sole proprietorships and all of the incorporation options. As a sole proprietor, you are liable for everything you do, and your personal assets may be accessible in the event of any problems. When you have an S Corp, a C Corp, or an LLC in place, you've separated out your personal assets from your business assets. And that's really the main benefit for most people that that necessitate the incorporation structure coming into play. So I spoke briefly about C Corps and the potential tax risks of owing both corporate tax and personal tax. S Corps and LLCs, again, generally more advisable for artist situations. These entities are both considered to be pass-through entities, which means that all income that's derived from your business activities passes through to you as an individual. So it doesn't get stopped at that corporate level. It just passes through to you. So there's only one level of taxation, which is important. Most states allow for single member LLCs. LLCs are sort of the relative newcomer to the corporate scene in that they really started to be put in place state by state starting in the 90s. Arizona definitely allows for single member LLCs, so good to keep in mind. One benefit of LLCs over S Corps is that they require less paperwork in general for the corporate management. However, be aware that there may be some different fees that apply. So again, this is where it's helpful to speak with a financial planner or an accountant to understand if there are specific fees that apply to LLCs that might not apply in the S Corp situation. For instance, in California, there's a pretty hefty, I think it's $800 a year minimum fee that has to be paid regardless of whether you've made any income or not. So that can be a bit of a burden if you are struggling. Nonprofit is, of course, another type of entity that a lot of people look to for art-related practices. And I just want to be very clear that nonprofit entity does not mean that you're not making any money. So just because you're not making money doesn't mean that nonprofit is a good entity to form. And the other way around, just because you're making money doesn't necessarily mean that nonprofits are not a good way to go. Really, the consideration is to determine whether the project or business that you're engaged in is for a charitable purpose or not. Generally speaking, nonprofits are organized either for a charitable purpose or it's within the art world, you'll see some trade support, so professional advocacy. But generally speaking, it comes down to the charitable purpose. One option, if you're engaged in kind of a hybrid practice, which more and more people are now, a lot of people are feeling that it's important to incorporate social justice and community outreach and other things that typically might fall under that charitable purpose umbrella into their practice. One other option, which you may or may not be familiar with, would be setting up a fiscal sponsorship through a nonprofit organization. They have to be 501c3, which is the charitable organization, in order to do that. What that means is that when you have a project that could potentially be a nonprofit type activity, but you're not really wanting to or in a position to set up an entirely separate nonprofit entity, you can partner or collaborate with another nonprofit organization. They receive the money that you may be getting as a result of donations or through grants. They hold that money and distribute it to you as you indicate to them that it needs to be paid out. There are some reporting requirements, so that hosting or sponsoring nonprofit needs to make sure that they can report to the IRS that you are indeed spending the money the way that you said you were going to spend it. They also tend to take a percentage of whatever you raise, so be aware of those fees. But again, this can be a very cost-efficient and nimble way of making use of that nonprofit status while maintaining whatever other business structure you have for your everyday practice. The last thing I'll mention for corporations is that in a lot of states, there are now the options of being a benefit corporation, which is for profit, but with a stated social justice purpose. And that tends to be more for marketing purposes than anything else, but it does allow you to focus a little bit more on social justice components or charitable components of a business. And if your state does not allow for benefit corporations, there's also a private entity that does certified B corporation services. And this is something that you can look into if your state does not have the benefit corporation option in place. I believe that you have to be in business for a year before you can go for that B certification, but it's something that's available. So now you'll understand when you see things like, I think it's King Arthur's Flour or Eileen Fisher, I believe Patagonia might also be a benefit corporation. When you see those designations, it's really a way for businesses to sit between for-profit and charitable businesses, making it clear that one of their main aims is to be charitable in their purpose. Okay, that was a lot about corporations. We're going to move on to doing business. All right, so 2 topics here: building teams and contracts. First is team building, and I'm just going to touch on this very briefly. It's really important, regardless what level you're at, no matter how your practice is organized, it's important to think about building support teams so that you've got people around you who can help with whatever it is that you're either struggling with or want to discuss or need to get done. That team can include accountants and lawyers, of course, but more and more artists are looking to other types of representation beyond just galleries or booking agents. And there are managers and other people who work as representatives within the creative industry. And some are better than others. My suggestion is before you get into a relationship with any other types of creative representatives, you check out to make sure that they're actually getting business for their clients. They're actually able to create opportunities that would be beneficial to you, rather than promising a portion of your income to somebody who's not really in a position to do much other than take that portion of your income. And at this point also, your team may include an online retailing service, and we can talk a little bit more about that later. I believe we also have a future session where we'll be going into much more detail about creating and maintaining online businesses. Contracts, which is my passion and something that I could talk about for a million years, and we'll talk about it in 2 minutes today. Contracts are super important for any kind of artistic practice. It's really great if you can keep in mind that while contracts may seem scary or daunting at first, consider them your friend. That's why I've got the 2 dolls shaking hands here. Insisting on a contract does not mean that you're intending to pursue litigation or that the other side is intending to pursue litigation. Think of it instead as an opportunity to articulate your intentions and your desires for that relationship, and clearly articulating and setting out expectations so that you can avoid disputes down the road. And we'll get to some dispute resolution issues in a moment. First of all, let me also say that contracts can be for pretty much anything that's not illegal. This is true in the art world as well as anywhere else. So obviously you can't be making contracts for illegal activities, but you can really hone and create whatever kind of agreement fits your particular situation. There aren't a lot of rules and regulations in terms of how you can structure that, as long as both parties agree and it's something that's actually going to be workable. Second thing, contracts do not need to be in writing, though it really is much better if they are. Oral agreements are enforceable, but it's always very difficult for people to agree on what had been orally determined. And so the best thing to do is to put things in writing. Generally speaking, nobody is being malicious in misremembering or remembering differently. It's just that the human memory is not a super reliable thing. Contracts in writing are much more reliable. Another thing I hear a lot about is, oh, we're friends. We've known each other for years. We've collaborated so many times before. We're just going to do this on a handshake. Sometimes that works, and that's great when it does. But if you really want to ensure that you're maintaining the friendship long-term and you are creating a situation where disputes are less likely to happen, putting something in writing up front is a really good idea. Even friends disagree, and you don't want your friendship to fall apart or a good business relationship to fall apart because you didn't put an agreement in writing. Okay, another issue on contracts is that they can sometimes be very complicated, and this is true. Depending on who is offering the contract, contracts could be, 65 pages long. If you're talking about contracts within a bureaucratic context, if it's connected to construction projects, sometimes they can be thousands of pages long. It's important that before you sign anything, you absolutely understand what it is you're signing. If there are contracts that are implicated in your arrangements, understand where they sit there. How much do you need to understand how much actually impacts you? Do not take the word of anybody saying, trust me, everything's fine, just go ahead and sign. Make sure that you actually have read through the contracts that are going to apply to you before you sign. The last thing that I'm going to touch on very briefly, because we're not dissecting a contract today, is to learn to negotiate. This is something that artists are very well served by, and it's important to remember that you are providing something of value that people appreciate, enjoy, and need. So it's important to understand your value as an artist and to be confident about that, and that can be a difficult thing. What I remind people is that you are absolutely able to negotiate contracts. You can ask for what you want. In fact, it's really important that you do that so that you're not feeling from the very beginning like you're being taken advantage of. And generally speaking, the worst thing that can happen if you ask for something that the other party doesn't want to give you is that they say no. It is very rare that by entering into a negotiating process and asking for what you want or need, that the other party is going to say, forget it, I'm done, and walk away. There's usually going to be some conversation before you get to that point, and hopefully you can gauge when you've pushed it to its limit and back off at that point to decide whether you actually want to move forward with that contract or not. It is true that one can be too persistent, and too persistent is not awesome, but absolutely getting to a place where you're comfortable with your value as an artist and asking for what you want or need is really important. The very last thing I'm going to leave you with is my recommendation that people be flexible, and that if nothing else, employ empathy. Put yourself in the other person's shoes. Think about where they're coming from. Sometimes when we understand why the other party is asking for something, we can understand better how to approach it. More often than not, especially in arts-related conversations and arts-related contracts, there is a way for everybody to get what they want. We can almost always get to that win-win situation without a terrible battle. The challenges tend to be over things like intellectual property, where there is a growing awareness of the importance of intellectual property, but also a reluctance to understand that intellectual property is a complex area and it can be dealt with in a myriad of different ways. So paying attention to what the other side is asking for and figuring out how you can be flexible and empathetic to their position will oftentimes get you to a place where you can ask for what you want and need and get a yes answer instead of just a quick no. Okay. Last area that we're going to cover, and then hopefully we can get into some questions and conversations here. Dispute resolution, and we're going to talk more about conflicts. I believe it's next week. So I'm just going to touch on a couple of things here. One is avoiding disputes, and this goes back to the conversation at the beginning about record keeping. Keeping notes of conversations is a great way of avoiding disputes, if only to remind yourself what you talked about, but it can also be something to refer back to even if you don't have a contract in place. Confirming conversations and understandings in writing, even if you're doing it by text or email, but do keep copies of those things, whether it's in printed out format or something that's saved into an electronic file. As I mentioned before, when we talked about contracts, read and understand things that you are signing. Again, that's the best way to avoid disputes, is to understand what it is you've agreed to do. Again, keep copies, electronic or hard copies, but definitely hang on to that documentation. It always makes it a lot easier if there are challenges down the road to figure out exactly where those points of resolution might lie. Remaining calm. Now, this is one that I'm not very good at taking the advice on either, but it is something to repeat over and over again. Taking the emotion out of conflict, especially when we're talking about work that can be very meaningful, is important when getting to a place where we can either walk away from a dispute or figure out the best resolution. So remaining calm, and if you're having trouble with that, contact an attorney. Oh, nice typo there. Contact an attorney, don't contact an attorney. Contact an attorney or another advisor, somebody who can help you remain a little bit distanced, focusing on the non-emotional business aspects of what needs to happen in order to avoid or resolve disputes. Okay, and I believe this is our last slide. If things are not able to be easily resolved through communication, and that would be the first way to deal with things, is by mutual agreement. I always recommend it's the least expensive and the most positive way to resolve disputes is to actually speak up, bring it to the attention of the other party, and come to a mutual agreement without involving third parties. If you need to involve a third party, mediation is the way to do it. First, I think mediation brings in a third party who is neutral, does not have any skin in the game or any conflicts, hopefully. And that person can listen to both sides and help you resolve. So in a mediation, there's no decision being made by that third party. It's simply that you've got somebody else who you both trust and respect helping you to resolve it. Sometimes that third objective perspective can give you a better view on what's worth hanging on to and what's not. If that doesn't work and you need to go to the next level, arbitration would be the next level. Some contracts require that arbitration is the way that disputes are resolved. Arbitration is when you have a third party that comes in and listens to both sides and makes a decision. That decision may be binding or non-binding, depending on whether the agreement is for binding or non-binding arbitration. If it is non-binding, it can be appealed to court. If it is binding, then that's the final call, and the decision of that arbitrator is going to be what prevails. Arbitrators are basically like judges. And then the final option is litigation. This is something that I did litigation for the first several years of my practice, and there's certainly a rush that lawyers get in being in the courtroom and dealing with those conflicts and making arguments and watching the jury. It's all a lot of fun in many cases. It's not fun for the clients. It's expensive. It drags on. And litigation, certainly any of you who've been involved in litigation, you know, it ends up benefiting really only the lawyers in terms of the fees that are being paid and any enjoyment that comes out of the process. For the most part, people who are engaged in the litigation, it's very emotionally draining. For an artist, it can be devastating in terms of being able to continue practicing. And in the end, it can be discouraging, especially if you're expecting justice out of litigation. So my recommendation for most creative people is to use every other tool at your disposal before you get to litigation in order to try to resolve disputes. I'm not talking about gigantic restitution cases or huge copyright infringement issues. I'm talking about your run-of-the-mill everyday contract disputes and project disputes that come up more frequently than anything else. Okay, so with that really quick overview of many different things, I am going to end it there. My contact information is on this slide. I do have an office hours program that I offer for especially for creative people. It came out of my desire to provide support for creative people and not charge them an exorbitant amount of money. So you can go to my website and check out the office hours program. It allows for an hour of consultation at a highly reduced rate. If in all of these series we don't get to your question and or you have a specific topic that you'd like to talk about, since I really can't, this is a good note as we go into the conversation, I can't give specific advice in this Q&A session. just general advice that hopefully will be helpful in the long run. Okay, so I will stop sharing my screen now. And Katie, are you moderating questions?
I'm actually going to ask Barry and Anel
Great.
as their backup. They've been monitoring the questions. And then Doug is actually going to share in the chat box the link to future conversations as well. Sarah mentioned we have 3 more of these sessions in this workshop series coming up. Dealing with conflict is the next session. Online business is the next session. Then we're going to skip the last Thursday in November because Thanksgiving. We're just going to take a little break and have some Thanksgiving, and then we'll come back the first Thursday in December and do intellectual property conversations. So let's go through the questions, Barry, and then at the end, I'm going to put out a quick poll if you guys want to hang on till the end, and you can give me some feedback about things you might want to hear more specifically in future conversations. So we've got some really good questions in the chat box. Let's go through those.
The first question is, remind us of your third point under budget. There was monthly expenses, occasional expenses, and what was the third?
The third thing is income. So that you can clearly see, of course, the artists are forgetting about the income part of it. So that you're able to actually create a budget that shows you where you are. Obviously, expenses and income together are going to show you how much you need to be charging, how far away you are from having a viable business practice, and hopefully you'll see that number go up over time.
And next, can you please describe some of the better filing, organizational, and record-keeping practices you've seen artists use and think that work well?
So that's an interesting question, and it really does depend on the practice of the artist. So obviously, someone who's creating visual art may need to keep track of formulas or paints or other aspects of what they're creating, in addition to the business records. Somebody who is performing is going to have a very different set of information that needs to be maintained within that business practice. I like using Dropbox. It's been a very good way to have something online where I can keep files in separate categories and then share that more easily. I have a lot of trouble. I'm not sure if it's just me or if it's systems on the other end as well. Large files tend to be difficult to email. And so especially when you're sharing visual files or larger documents or PowerPoint presentations, generally email is not going to be a good way to exchange that, but having some sort of online system that allows you to share specific files, just be careful you're only sharing the ones that you mean to share and not everything else in your online filing system. So I like Dropbox. That's, I'm not advocating for them. It's just that that's what we've ended up implementing with my office. There are a number of other systems, certainly Google Docs, that sort of thing works well. Also, there is also a choice that needs to be made in terms of how you file things. And that, again, is kind of a personal question. A number of years ago, somebody was asking a group of people, how do you envision a calendar in your head? And I thought that was a really interesting exercise. I had never thought that other people, I realize this sounds stupid, I had never realized that other people visualized calendars in their heads differently from the way I did. And so understanding that different people visualize organization and structure in different ways is important in terms of recommending or advising on a particular filing system. So my suggestion is create your filing system and your organization system based on something that makes sense to you. It needs to also be accessible by outside folks. So if it's really crazy, you might want to have either an assistant who's trained or have some sort of guide to how your filing system works. But things like organizing correspondence and engagements by month works, or it could be by venue. It could be, for visual artists by gallery or by client. So depending on whether you want to tie that organizational system to your own working and the passage of time, so that you know, oh, I did that a few months ago, I'll go back and look in March, or maybe it was April, or you can be creating your files around the specific projects. I myself like to have specific project files, just because especially during COVID, there is quite a time warp going on, and I can't remember when I've done anything at this point. It's much easier to remember it by project. So I hope that helps to answer that question.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm getting a message from someone that they've lost their audio connection. Is everybody else doing okay? Can I get some thumbs up? Okay. Okay, good. I think it just might be unique to Barry, but since Barry has lost his audio connection and he is the one monitoring the questions, and Nell, do you have the next question?
Yes, the next question says, I was told that courts aren't recognizing one-person LLCs as valid protection for personal assets. Is that correct?
I am not aware of that. Generally speaking, LLCs will provide you with the same sort of protection as an NS corporation does in terms of the limited liability. The danger is if you are mixing personal and business assets, then sometimes there can be an argument that's made that's called piercing the corporate veil. So if you have not created a separate bank account, if you have not created separate business procedures, that's again why this filing system can be very important, is to show that there is a clear separation between your personal operations and your business operations. Then you can destroy the value of that corporate structure. So maintaining those different hats very clearly is crucial to maintaining the limited liability that an LLC, S Corp, or C Corp will provide to you. I didn't mention another type of, it's not really corporate structure, but relationship that may be important, especially for artists, and that is the partnership. Oftentimes with collaborations, people talk about partnerships. I would caution you to not use the word partnership because it does have legal meaning. And the problem with partnerships is that you end up being responsible for your partner's negligent activities as well as your own. So when we're talking about business arrangements, being very clear about separating business from personal and separating your liability from other people's liability, those are ways that you need to think in order to maintain that separation. So back to the original question, I am not aware of courts negating the protection provided by single member LLCs. So I would have to have some more information about why that happened. I'm imagining that it's because there was maybe too much of a mixing of personal and business assets and activities.
The next question is, could you give some examples? What do you do when a city hands you a contract in advance of even applying for a project, indicating that your application is contingent on accepting the contract?
Aha, yes. So on the one hand, I actually like it when you can see the agreement up front. It's nice to know what the terms are going to be. It's nice to know that you can see exactly what the expectations are up front. That's great. What I don't love is that oftentimes when that's the case, when that contract is being offered in advance, artists are being asked to waive rights that I don't think they should waive. So be very careful when you're handed a contract and told that you have to agree to it before you can even apply. Pay particular attention to the copyright and intellectual property section of that contract. It's really important to understand what it is you're giving up if you're agreeing to those terms ahead of time. Otherwise, in terms of the big picture, it's nice to know what those expectations are going to be. If that's the contract that you're going to be given in the end, it's helpful to know what the terms of that arrangement are going to be. Oftentimes with cities, it's very difficult to negotiate different terms. The process that cities have to go through in order to create their contracts in the first place is pretty elaborate. There are a lot of people that have to weigh in and vote and approve. So it's difficult to get bigger changes through in the contracts. So negotiating with cities and municipal agencies for vastly different terms can be a challenge in the first place. And so it can be helpful to know what their expectations are. If you're seeing very draconian terms that you think are not fair, number one, maybe you don't do that job. Number two, it would be great if you could advocate for some change and inform that body, whoever is giving you that contract, that this may be contrary to best practices. Since you know how they all listen to artists all the time.
On that note, Sarah, where would you guide somebody to look for best practices? Would you send them to the Americans for the Arts, or?
I would. I mean, of course, I'm biased because I worked with the PAN Council when I was there on the best practices. There are a number of best practices that we came up with for public art commissions, and I think that's a really great place to look. You can look to professional organizations, depending on what best practices it is that you're interested in investigating. If we're talking about appraisals or art consultants and other professionals that are engaged, there are best practices listed oftentimes through those professional trade organizations. But in terms of how artists should be treated, Americans for the Arts is a really great resource for that. And as well, in many communities around the country, there are volunteer lawyers for the arts, and those organizations will sometimes maintain resources for artists that you can use as part of either self-advocacy or in working with somebody to represent you.
And typically, aren't volunteer lawyers for the arts through a university setting, or can there sometimes be independent groups?
No, they in fact, they're generally not through university settings. They tend to be separate nonprofit organizations. Some are more formalized than others. But in most cases, I mean, there are some excellent volunteer lawyer for the arts programs around the country. Many of them are not excellent, only in that, you're talking about people volunteering their time. So the value of those organizations are going to be based on the support that the lawyers get who are volunteering and who's volunteering. It could be a very inexperienced lawyer who's looking for some work to practice on. It may be that it's somebody whose practice area has absolutely nothing to do with the arts, but they love art themselves, and so they're interested in helping artists, but they may or may not actually have the experience or the knowledge of the way that the art market works, or that particular creative industry works. So it's important to be cautious about those resources as well. Some are provided through universities, and when that's the case, sometimes there's a clinic, and that may mean that there's either a sliding scale or free opportunity to go in and get specific time and advice from law students. If it is law students, presumably they are supervised by either a professor or a practicing lawyer. So those can be good resources as well.
I think we missed one question, or maybe we covered it. The question was, could you give some examples of the typical kinds of disputes that could come up?
Aha. Well, we are going to talk at greater length next week about disputes. So I would encourage you to come back next week so we can talk more at length about that. But typical disputes, I mean, they come in all shapes and sizes, of course, but I would say that intellectual property is an area that tends to be challenging because that's something that is, like I say, a little complex. Different understandings of what it means to own intellectual property. Oftentimes, organizations, whoever's purchasing or owning the work in the end, feels that if they're paying money for that artwork, that they should get not only the artwork, but everything that comes along with it, including the copyrights. And that's a tough one because that is not a best practice. The best practice is for the copyrights to remain with the artist, even though the physical work itself is sold and title is transferred to the owner. So that's one area that frequently is a subject of dispute. Payments and scheduling, also another area that's challenging. And what I suggest there is that in general, good communications will help tremendously. Artists oftentimes will be feeling so much pressure to get something done according to the schedule, and they know they're not going to get there, but they're scared to call and tell the contracting party that they're running behind. Don't be afraid. The best thing to do is to communicate. Usually there's flexibility, whether it's on scheduling, whether it's on materials that need to be changed. Most of the time, there's enough flexibility within those relationships that good communication can solve 99% of the issues that come up. Other areas of dispute might be in payments. And that's really important as well, because obviously artists don't generally have deep pockets to be supporting projects if they're not getting paid on time. Another issue that comes up frequently when works are being commissioned is that there's a lack of understanding on the part of the commissioning future owner that there's a cost that goes into creating artwork that is not the same. It's not at the same rate as regular contractors. So it's not the same as putting in a plumbing system or electrical work. There may need to be a front-loaded payment made in order to give the artist the resources to create what it is they're creating. So that's another area of potential controversy. And there are many more.
Thanks, Sarah.
Sure.
I have opened up a little poll. If you guys could complete that. This is my first time doing a poll on WebEx, so bear with me. But that will help us inform future workshop topics. And we're going a little bit over time, but I've got 2 more questions that I want to make sure we can go over. And if any more questions come in after this, then I'll need to answer them via email, or Sarah and I will work on getting you an answer. The first question is, should we be anything that we should be aware of when considering working with fabricators or art agencies outside the US?
Yes, that's an excellent question. Yes. Lots of things. Maybe that's the best answer. Yes, there are things to be concerned with in working with people outside the country. That said, a lot of artists do. I mean, China certainly has quite a lot of fabrication facilities that work well in a lot of situations. China is also known for not being particularly respectful of artists' copyright. So frequently, what happens is work that is sent to China for fabrication may also be copied, knocked off, and reproduced for other purposes. So that is definitely something to be very aware of. The other thing is to be aware of the materials that are being used. I've had a number of situations where work produced outside the United States was supposed to be done in stainless steel. Turns out it's not really stainless steel. And so, a few months into installation, things start rusting, and that can be a big problem because it's going to be up to the artist to make good on that, and that can be a very expensive process. Things like shipping and the cost of bringing things in and out of the United States can be daunting, and so it's important to keep track of those costs. Might not be something that's evident right at the very beginning of that interaction, so making sure that you understand the full scope of the costs involved with manufacturing something outside the US is important. It can also be in violation of contract terms. A lot of contracts, especially government contracts, will require local purchasing or US purchasing to happen. And so there may be some question as to whether working with a fabricator outside the US is even allowed under the contract rules. I am a believer in using the best products for the job, of course. But I think it does pay to take some time to look around and see if there are local fabricators that can help with the work. On the one hand, it may seem upfront that it's more expensive. It might be on the other end that, if you don't have to redo the work 2 or 3 times, it's actually less expensive. If you don't have to pay for the transportation of the work, it's less expensive. You have a better ability to go and see the progress of the work, see the quality of the work that's being done, and correct it in process, as opposed to getting pictures from overseas. Again, that said, I've got a lot of clients that work in Italy or China or Germany or Canada, and 9 times out of 10, it's just fine. So it depends on the project, but there are certainly a lot of considerations.
I have just a little bit to add on that, being from Phoenix, if you're local to Phoenix or Arizona, you are very lucky. There are so many there's an incredible concentration of all different kinds of fabricators here in this area. Recommend talking to your other artists who have worked on similar projects or projects that you've done in the past. If you're not from Phoenix, look around here, pretty easy to get to. And there are some really incredible, especially metal fabrication, terrazzo fabrication in this particular area. Okay, we have one more question because we're at 11:05. We're really running over time. One last question. If you can get omissions and errors, does this limit your liability in lieu of being an LLC?
Well, sure. I mean, insurance helps. So, right, whether it's insurance or a corporate structure, the idea is to limit liability. That said, the reason for incorporating is to protect your personal assets from being attached and separating out that business project from your personal assets. So even if you have insurance, which may or may not cover the full extent of whatever the liability is, what you want to keep from happening from the very start is that anybody can even look at your personal assets when you've got a business challenge. So insurance is definitely recommended, and it can diminish the potential outlay that you're going to have in the event that you're liable, but it should not be thought of as a replacement for an incorporation.
Great. I think we have hit the max of our time here. Thank you everyone who completed the poll and participated with us today. Mitch, you want to close this out?
Just want to say thank you to Sarah and to the group for joining us, and register for next week and we'll continue the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.